Teleportation will commence in 5 minutes. Do not leave any luggage unattended. Unattended luggage will be removed and destroyed. Attention, ladies and gentlemen. This is an announcement from Planet X31. Please take your seats. Teleportation will commence in 2 minutes.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Columbia, this is Houston, AOS, over.
Exercise to test the reactions of troops to atom bombs used in support of an attack.
1-0-0-5-7-2.
with different degrees.
And welcome to this episode of Science and Cocktails. Science and Cocktails is an initiative with the purpose of bringing first-class scientific information directly to you, Earthlings, without interference of any other type of intermediate media. Its aim is to make the flow of thoughts and the flow of sensorial perception as smooth as the flow of a cocktail mixture. Tonight's teleportation will be guided by Kirsten Halsnæs, Professor of Climate and Economics at ITU Management Engineering. Her research includes the development of methodologies for quantitative climate change and sustainable development studies. Kirsten Halsnæs is part of the IPCC Climate Panel, who has won the Nobel Prize in 2007 for peace. In her talk here tonight, she will give us the most recent update on the science and politics of climate change and what the governmental and the private sector are trying to do in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in our current planet. She will tell us about the new IPCC report that has been published recently, and she will discuss the possibilities that can help fertilize the green development.
Ladies and gentlemen, after the words of Kirsten Halsnæs, the Oslo-based group Moon Relay is playing noise rock. The music is repetitive and strict, but at the same time free and open. It is both dancey and strong-key freeform.
Let's give a warm welcome to Kirsten Halsnæs.
So, hello, all of you. I'm very impressed about that so many people want to come here and discuss climate change and listen to my presentation. And I'll try to do my best to make it a little bit personal and exciting for you. I'm an economist, but I'm quite critical about if this is all about traditional economic assessment and about whether it's worth paying for saving the world. So that's some of the lessons I will try to share with you and try to initiate a discussion about how we should consider this very important issue. Talking about the financial crisis, sometimes you get rid of something very bad, as you can see on the picture here. Some very old energy-consuming cars. But is the financial crisis good for solving the climate problem? This is the questions I have been asked to discuss a little bit here, and I'll give some arguments for how the financial crisis put a context for climate change policies and how it goes. Maybe you think that climate change is about some atmospheric science, and that's why I'm starting with this figure, as you see here. This is taken from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and this is showing a structure of the climate change problem. And if you start in the top corner here, Now, if you start in that corner up there, you can see that climate change emerged from greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, which is causing the climate change problems. But if you want to do something about climate change, it's not enough to be a specialist in atmospheric processes and climate change in the top corner. You have to move down into this corner. And this is where the problem really emerged, because climate change is caused by the greenhouse gas emissions, and they are closely related to economic development, technological change, population and governance all around the world. So this is why economics and social decision making is very important if we want to do anything about climate change. We have to move down into the basic roots of the problems and see if we can do something about it, and to frame our societies and our behavior and our economy in a way where we get rid of this bad problem. Climate change, maybe we cannot prove it, but we already today see a lot of very serious extreme weather events, and it's an early warning of what could really happen if this emerged to be a much more serious problem. And this is showing a flooding of a highway to Stockholm some years ago. We also have other events in Mexico. We just had the landslides and heavy rain, and as you can see, the transportation infrastructure was seriously harmed. And this is another picture from Mexico, where you see this, the flooding and the railway and so on. In Japan, you just had hurricanes, and they have also been threatening this Fukushima nuclear power plant, and some of the radioactive waste could be flooded and spread around. you had problems last year in New York, as you can see with all the yellow taxis here from a hurricane. And it actually, I think maybe some people thought that was pretty important because maybe it could learn the US that climate change is actually quite important. You had big hurricanes in Colorado. Everything was turned around, as you can see with the house on the picture. And that was recently, a month or 2 months ago here. And also, some years ago, we had this very serious hot spell in Europe, where I think it was up to 30,000 elderly people that died due to this hot spell. And this could be like, maybe it looks very nice with this little beach party sort of picture from Paris, but actually it's pretty serious when you have these events of hot spells. In Australia right now, this looks very romantic with this little nice koala bear, but they have very heavy forest fires right now, and it's the worst forest fires they've had for years. So they're also facing climate change. But actually, and this is very much to my own heart and what I have spent a lot of time on, the most serious impacts you will see in developing countries. And this is a picture from this cyclone that just happened in India from the Bay of Bengali, where they had this cyclone that came in, and actually they moved away. 1 million people was evacuated in order to prevent damages from this hurricane. And I think they were pretty successful with this evacuation, and I think only maybe 20,000 people died. But a few years ago, where they had a similar event, I think it was much more people that died, maybe 100,000, something like that. So it actually shows that it helps to do something. And we have another picture, I think this is from India also. We have this problem, as you know, in Bangladesh and India, where they're sharing these big rivers, where you have a lot of big flooding events. When the water is coming from the Himalaya and goes through Bangladesh, sometimes 60% of the area of Bangladesh is flooded. And then this very serious problem emerged, that the dirty water from the missing sanitary systems and so are mixed up with the clean water, and cholera epidemic starts, and it's a really serious threat to people. So when I'm talking about climate change, one of the major issues I have with that is that it's actually hitting the poorest people in the world most, because they're the most vulnerable ones, but they're not the ones that have caused the problem. I don't know if you know, but climate change is emerging from the accumulated stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And in the atmosphere, the dominant greenhouse gas is CO2. And the CO2 has a lifetime in the atmosphere of up to 100 years. So all these impacts we see today are actually the result of what has happened during the last 100 years. And as you know, who has developed during the last 100 years? This is industrialized countries, where we through our industrial revolution and our high sort of economic development actually have emitted all these emissions. And what happens today is that poor countries that are yet not at this development level as us are suffering from all these damages. And this is really a bad thing. Temperature curves, and that's something, it started around 1860, because there you had the first measurements of temperature. And as you can see, it goes up and down, of course, from year to year, but there's a rising trend in the temperature increases. And sometimes it goes a bit faster, sometimes a bit slower. And there was some discussion up to the recent IPCC report about that in the last decade, the temperature had increased a little bit less, which was explained by the climatologists by that the oceans had taken up a lot of the heat and the temperature in the oceans had increased more than previously. But climate change is emerging, and this is just one of the signs of that. Recently, a few weeks ago, there was a very interesting article in Nature where they had calculated how different parts of the world, or when different parts of the world could experience a temperature that was in 3 years after each other in these big climate modeling ensembles would exceed the whole sort of variation that had been in the period from 1860 to 2005. And then they found out that around, if you take a look at this map we have here, then in the tropical areas around the equator, these climate events where you had higher temperatures than what you had in this whole variation in the long time frame would come in the first early time around the tropical regions. And you can see this here, that they were defining in 2029 in Lagos, 2036 was a year where these changes in the mean temperature would arrive first. And that means that with all these climate modeling projections, actually based on a lot of these scenarios and modeling studies, what we could expect is that in the poorest part of the world, these climate impacts would emerge fastest. And it was also in this Nature paper, I think you can find it because it's free on the internet, you should try to take a look at that, because I think it has a lot of interesting conclusions. It showed that in terms of ecosystem sensitivity, these areas where climate change would emerge in the most early stage is also the most vulnerable areas of the ecosystems in the world. For example, the coral reefs and different ecosystems and so. So it was quite easy to show that in these very vulnerable ecosystems, you would very, very soon experience some serious temperature changes that could cause some very serious harm. But again, if we return to my argument about developing countries and poor countries, it was also clear in this paper that what would happen was that where you would see the most early appearance of these climate events would be in the countries with the lowest income. You can see it on this diagram here. So, and the same, if you are trying to see how many people are living in these parts of the world where you will see very serious climate consequences very soon, it is a very big share of the world population. So this is also, in a way, confirming that we know that around 80% of the world population live in the poor countries of the world, and this is also the place where we soonest will see serious climate change impacts. So this is really an enormous equity sort of concern about climate change. That is not only a matter of whether we would like to change our lifestyle or energy system, it's also a matter of whether we think it's fair that we can, or have for the last 100 of years, lived in our way and developed our industry and energy systems, but now we think this is okay, too expensive to afford to solve these problems, and then we'll just leave the problems as they are in developing countries. And I think when we are creating such potential disasters, it's not always going as well as it went in the Olympic Games some years ago. I don't know if you saw this movie with this 49er, the Danish boat, where the mast was falling down, and they were able to get back to the harbor and borrow the boat from Croatia, and actually ended up winning the gold medal in a very exciting sort of game. But I'm not sure that we could really expect such a thing in climate change. I think we should maybe be better prepared and not just try to bet on something that is so uncertain. So I will show you a little video. And the idea of this video is that it's in a way, for me, an illustration of what happens if you're doing like a very, very stupid economist. I don't know if you heard about, do you know what cost-benefit analysis is? Yeah, it makes sense in many contexts. But if you're trying to use cost-benefit analysis to measure whether it's worth saying the whole world, then you are doing something very stupid. And that's what I want to illustrate with this little movie here. So this is showing something about cost-benefit analysis.
I want to be alone. Out Caesar, out Notice, Emperor of the world.
So sad. Okay, I just think for me it's a good picture of what you should not do, play around in this way. But we can do other things when we are making climate change studies. And actually it's something I enjoyed in all these IPCC, UN sort of scientific assessments. You have an opportunity to meet experts around the world, and maybe it's a surprise to you because we know that the US is maybe a bit backwards in climate change policies. But you have an enormous valuable scientific research in the US about all this, so there's actually a very rich literature on climate change if any of you want to work on it. But coming back to cost-benefit analysis, some years ago there was these so-called consensus conferences made on whether it could pay off to make climate change investments. I was extremely irritated about that. I thought it was really misuse of my good economic science and so. And for me it was very absurd that you could see pictures like this. This is taken from the homepage of Copenhagen Consensus. And the idea was that you had some big conference here in Copenhagen where some big experts that actually had the Nobel Prize. They could discuss whether it best paid off to spend some $1 million on fighting terrorism, vaccinating children, or making some war, or reducing climate change impacts, which I think is absurd to make such comparisons. And to put monetary value on that. I don't know what the monetary value is of avoiding some war or stopping a terrorist or shooting sort of Al-Qaeda leaders or whatever it is. I don't know how you do that. But then there was some discussions, and the argument was that it's not a good idea to spend money on combating climate change. You should rather spend money on giving fresh water to children in Africa. But at the same time, we could see, like you see in the left picture, that they had droughts in Africa. They had no water. So this was a false dilemma, that you could first give them some water and then you could ensure that they had water afterwards or whatever, I don't know. It was a lot of absurd discussions. So if you go back to Mexico, as I talked about, where you had these climate events, the discussion very often ends up like a discussion about whether it is very good that we now in Denmark in the future could grow some wine, some grapes, and we could make our own wine. Is that better? What is the benefit of that compared with that these poor people are suffering in Mexico? Which again I think is a bit funny. And we are also getting into some economic valuation problems sometimes, and this is what you're seeing here is Lady Justice. It's a sort of symbol of what is done sometimes, because when we have climate change, people could suffer from different health impacts. Like it could be mortality, but it could also be different diseases and malaria and other things. And then if you're making a very traditional monetary evaluation of whether it pays off to save some human lives, then in some of these assessments, you are actually using different values for people living in different parts of the world, because the argument is that if this happy guy, I think he's Danish, because he's the most happy person in the world maybe, and he's pretty fat, and the benefit of avoided sort of benefit of him dying is the same as 22 people in Bangladesh because they're so poor. So it means that if you're comparing what we should be willing to pay in Denmark in terms of reducing greenhouse gases with the value of saving 22 people from dying in Bangladesh, then it's the same sort of value of the lives. So I think that's a stupid way to do it. But of course you can do it in many different ways. You can use the same life value for different people. I'm just trying to highlight some of how some of these assumptions come out in some of these calculations. And when we are talking about climate change, as I said, the lifetime of CO2, for example, in the atmosphere is 100 years. So it means that what we are doing today has a big consequence of our life, of the life we can offer to our grandchildren or great-grandchildren. So this is also about between generations. So when we are using fossil fuels, burning coal, emitting greenhouse gases, we are actually making some consequences of how people can live 100 or several hundred years from now, which should also be taken into consideration. A very sort of popular political goal has been that we should try to ensure that global warming shouldn't increase beyond 2 degrees. This has been the official EU target and has been very predominant in the international climate debates. But I'll just try to explain to you what it would really require to meet this 2 degrees target. This is a figure showing some scenarios for what it would mean if you wanted to ensure that global temperature, mean temperature wouldn't go above the 2 degree level. And what we have here is sort of the time frame, and we have the carbon emissions on the y-axis. And then the dotted line is a sort of reference case or the baseline. What would happen if we just continue without any climate change policy? Then, as you could expect, greenhouse gases would just increase. But if you needed to be sure, given the carbon budget of what you could have in the atmosphere, that the temperature wouldn't be more than 2 degrees, then you would have to go down to the red line. So actually, what you should compare is the dotted line, top level, and the red line. So I think it's quite easy to see that in 2050, your emission would maybe only be allowed to be like 20% or something of what they were in 2000. And this is an enormous challenge. to be able to reduce emissions so much. At the same time as developing countries, emerging economies are industrializing, building up their economies, making roads, bridges, industry, houses, everything. So this is more or less, I would say, a green revolution to get rid of all the carbon in the energy systems and so. But actually, it's not totally impossible, and I will also try to talk a little bit more about how this could be done. Actually, even the American economies, they think this could be done. It's a bit far going. It's radical, but it's not totally impossible. The problem is, and in a way I've said that already, this is just showing with the dotted line is some emission projections for developing countries. In UNFCCC terminology, we call them non-Annex 1. And the stable lines are industrialized countries. And this is just showing that emissions in developing countries would be growing more. And they're already bigger now in industrialized countries. And I already said that. And I think it's just as it is. So it doesn't help that we are saying that we are willing to do a lot in Denmark. We are ahead of everything, and we are very good in the EU, and we can reduce our emissions, we can do this and that. It doesn't help actually on the problem. I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything, but it's not enough. It's more important that we help the rest of the world to reduce their emissions. Also, if you take this figure that I have from the IEA. IEA is the International Energy Agency. It's showing where the major sort of increase in energy demand would be in the future. And this is, of course, in China and India and so, because they're building up the economy and they have a lot of industry, so they will have a lot of energy demand. Which also means that we will have to collaborate with these countries and try to get them to implement other technologies than only conventional coal-fired power plants and things like that. Another sort of, so what we have to do in general is to try to get into this discussion about which energy technologies you would choose. In Denmark, we were making this work for the Climate Commission, where the goal has been approved by the government afterwards that Denmark should go for 100% renewable energy. And in our case, it's a choice between the wind energy, the coal, the gas, the solar energy, and the bioenergy and so. But this is about the same sort of issues they have in many other countries, but with some other technologies also. The IEA, as I just mentioned, they're also making scenarios for how you could meet the 2-degree temperature target as I talked about. And they made this recent scenario up to 2050. And as you can see here, a major part of the emission reductions that you could expect that could be economic efficient to go for in the first round would be end-use energy efficiency and energy savings and more efficient energy conversion. And then you will have some fuel switching, and then you will have some renewable energy and nuclear power and so on. And if you had extended the analysis to be up to 2100, the longer time we go into the future, the more renewable energy you get in all these scenarios. And the reason why you get more in the future is both because it will always be economic attractive to start with all the energy savings and efficiency improvements in the first period. It's waste of money to use too much energy. And then you introduce renewable energy, and renewable energy is also expected to be cheaper with time due to research and development and so. So you start with all the efficiencies, energy savings and things like that. We have a problem with the pleasure of driving, as I would call it. Yeah. Because if you take the vehicle stock of private cars, take a look at the numbers for China and India, for example, how much growth you actually would expect. I think around the year of 2000, you had only 10 million cars, private cars in India. And they had a population of 1.1 billion. So I think it's quite easy to imagine how big a growth you could have in these countries in the cars. So this is one of the most difficult problems to solve in the climate change sort of challenge, because in terms of energy technologies and fuels, we are really behind in the transportation sector, and we are not having a lot of very easy solutions. It's much easier in the electricity sector and the heating sector to solve these problems. So we have to manage the Chinese dragon, get control of it. It's already well equipped for the air pollution. But we also have to do more, and this is showing these prime ministers, the presidents that came to the Copenhagen meeting in 2015, and actually was sitting around the table with President Obama out in the Bella Center. And I think it was, we can say many bad things about that meeting, but I think it was extremely good that these presidents and prime ministers came, because this was the first very important step to get climate change on the agenda as an economic problem for the top people in the government, and not just some sort of little playing ground for ministers of environment that were not so important. So I thought we should also talk about economic growth, because since I'm an economist, I'm often asked by some people, okay, are you not against economic growth? If we could just get rid of that bad thing, we could really solve the problem. I'm not against economic growth, because I think the issue is not to stop economic growth, but to find out how to manage it in the right way. And I will try to give you some arguments about that. But of course, you can always say that if you have enough economic crisis and the whole economy is going down and no industry can produce, then you have no greenhouse gas emission. But I don't think that's the best solution to that problem. This economic growth debate is a very old one. It has been going on for several centuries. And for example, this old guy called Malthus, he was very famous because he was already in the 1700th century writing a very famous book that proved that the whole economic system and the world would go down, because population growth would just mean that you couldn't feed the population. Since then we learned that there was some productivity growth in agriculture, and maybe we also learned that there's also some regulatory mechanism that maybe population growth will decrease a bit when people become richer. So this sort of catastrophic development trend has not really showed so up in this way. So today I think we have a lot of this debate about these catastrophic scenarios. Often in the climate debate, you hear the argument that climate is not the problem. The problem is population growth. So the UN should rather make a meeting and controlling population, and then you could forget about climate change. And I think this is a very trivial discussion, because if you could stop population growth, of course, that would be good for many reasons. But this is not really the cause of the problem. The cause of the problem is the way we use our energy and produce and so forth. And if we're able to help developing countries to make a sustainable development and to ensure a good income and living for the people, then they could also control the population, as we have done in our part of the world. Then some other argument is we should go for non-material consumption, and we should give up working, and we should just have other life qualities. Okay, we can argue. I don't believe in it, because I really see people being interested in a good life. But I will give you some more arguments about that. I think the problem is not economic growth. It's the way the economy is growing. And let us dig a little bit into what is economic growth. It's not just a general thing that some politicians have decided that now we should have 2%, 3%, blah, blah, blah. Economic growth is actually emerging through our productions. A way where you can ensure that the way that the economic is growing is where we can use some resources, like some fuels or raw materials, other things we use in the production. Or through labor. If we work a lot, we produce more. Or if we invest in man-made capital, machinery and other things, can also increase what we produce in the economy. Or a key thing is technological change. So think about a car, for example. If we have a new car that can run much more efficiently and spend less gasoline, or use less gasoline, then it's a technological change and you get more miles for the gasoline. It's a sort of technological change that gives you some higher output for the same resource. So economic growth is something that can happen when you are using your inputs in a more efficient way, or if you have some technologies that can help you to get more out of the inputs you have. For me, it sounds very positive. Maybe that's because I'm spoiled by the technical university. I'm trying to joke with it. Now, I'm just trying to say that economic growth can be bad. When you're using too many resources, nothing is left for the future generations, you're producing a lot of pollution, other things, then economic growth is bad. But if economic growth is managed in a way where you're not allowing pollution, you're not allowing overutilization of resources, and you are trying to promote technological development in a way where you're saving resources and getting rid of environmental problems, then technological change can also help you to get out of these problems. So if we want to get control of climate change, for example, if some people can develop new renewable energy technologies or very energy-saving lighting options, other things, then there's economic growth in the good and the green way. So at least there are some nuances in that. But policies are needed, so we need to get Christian and the Minister of Finance a little bit engaged in that. They're not too engaged right now. They need to put some borders around the economy and not to allow all these negative environmental impacts. So my approach would be that we should develop some new technologies, and we should make green business attractive. And that can be, for example, with putting taxes on dirty industry, on coal consumption, on CO2 emissions. We should also stop subsidizing bad things in agriculture and things like that. All together we should make very attractive, make the green production and to punish the sort of bad production by taxes and regulations and standards and things like that. And of course we should also ensure that research and innovation can help to bring these new green technologies forward. And all this green technology deployment is something that developing countries are very interested in. They want to get these technologies and also to compete with us about export and getting market shares. So I believe, I'm not saying that technology is the only solution, I'm just saying since we are not getting big UN agreements by our policymakers right now, then we have to do something in practice about solving some of these problems, and I think technologies are pretty important here. Then we can ask ourselves, is it hopeless? We have no climate change agreement. Should we give up and just complain and cry and say, oh, the world is awful and politicians are stupid and we can't do anything? Of course we have a problem. Climate change is a sort of tragedy of the commons. It's a global problem, and the problem is that we have to solve it all together in the world. And that's of course the reason why it has been so attractive to talk about climate change UN agreements. But since we're not having this agreement now, I don't think it's a reason for stopping doing something. We have to find a way where our own national initiatives, EU initiatives, initiatives of individuals and companies can move the problem. And it is actually moving. For example, many cities of the world, and I think Copenhagen is a front runner, they have made their own very ambitious plans for CO2 neutrality. They want to be front runners in these issues, and they're attracting a lot of people who think it's attractive to live in a city like that. We have a lot of companies. For example, we have this Environment Green Growth Forum going on in Copenhagen today and yesterday, where people want to promote themselves as the green companies. Maybe you say this is hypocritic and we don't trust them, but at least we should push them to go on with that. We have countries that want to take advantage, as I said, in green technologies, and then we have the green consumers. And I brought this picture of the cow because it's just a small thing, but it actually matters what you are eating. Because if you are eating, if you like beef meat, for example, then the emissions of 1 kilo of greenhouse gas emissions of 1 kilo of beef is 6 times higher than emissions of 1 kilo of chicken meat. And the pork is something in between. It's because these the beef and the sheep and so on, they are ruminants, so they have these methane emissions. They are very strong greenhouse gas emissions. So if you want to feel very good, you're doing something, eat vegetables and chicken, and sometimes beef, but not every day. You can do something. Okay, so this is from Sønderborg. They are one of these front runners in green sort of cities and ambitious climate targets, and it's very successful. So, as the last part here, I'll talk a little bit about the financial crisis. Is it good for the climate policy or is it bad? I think we have some new geopolitical conditions framing climate change policies. And oil markets and this whole sort of idea about security of energy supply is important, and it has driven a lot of climate policies, also because, for example, the US was very afraid independent of the Arab countries. But now the US are very happy because they discovered some new oil shale and gas shale resources. So the prices, they're beginning to produce more energy themselves, gas and oil, which means that the prices have decreased. And it's like the fossil fuels are returning a bit more on the agenda, which makes it more difficult to promote renewable energy. We also have new, very sensitive security issues related to the Arctic and the mining and the oil platforms there. So this is also important in relation to international policy and climate change policies. That if you're opening some of the mines in Greenland, you could also get some of the rare metals that you can use for some of the renewable energy sources, and so it could also change the prices and the global picture. And then you have a very serious problem with the euro crisis and the monetary union and the very high unemployment rates we have in Europe, which means that it's more difficult to get the European Union to go for very unified, strong climate policies. But climate policies can also help economic recovery. For example, if we can protect the European green tech industry, I think this is a major factor in EU's very holy sort of policy profile in climate change, that we have some very expensive industry here in Europe, and if you can set high environmental standards, maybe these stupid Chinese or India cannot compete on that. That's what they think. And also we could promote investments in very employment-intensive sort of activities like energy renovation of buildings and other things. So it's a way where you can align climate policies and financial crisis management. And you can also have all these corporate social responsibility paradigms and green business profiles. But the financial crisis can also create barriers for climate policies. Capital is scarce, it's difficult to borrow money. You have a high energy cost if you introduce renewable energy, which is a problem for low-income families. And you have this polluter's heaven argument that if we are imposing a lot of restrictions on our industry, then they will just move to China. And actually, this is a picture from this weekend in Rome. You have these big sort of actions because they have 30% unemployment, and so this unemployment issue is extremely serious in EU policies. So we should remember that it's more difficult to ensure that a lot of money is going into green investments if some people can argue that, okay, that would just increase unemployment. Up to the Copenhagen meeting, climate meeting in 2009, it was extremely trendy among Danish companies to say that we are very climate friendly. So you had Danfoss who thought they could earn a lot of money on this market with the thermostats and all that. And then they had a wonderful picture of the perfect Danish family. The husband is an engineer, dark hair, and the blonde, the boy and the girl and the wife. Wonderful. And you also had high expectation for the wind energy stocks. It almost looked like the Chinese wall, always going up. But as you know now, it has been a bit difficult for Danish companies to compete with the Chinese and with Siemens and others. So this is also a bit problematic. We have Angela Merkel. This is a nice yellow Audi. And she has been accused for being too close to the German industry because there's just been discussions in the EU about these car efficiency standards and the norms. And she was a bit too happy about the yellow Audi, so now they're trying to relax a bit on the standards. We had a nice campaign in Japan. You know, the Sapporo beer. This was also up to this climate meeting. They were changing from this very old, very popular label on the beer to this one. And I don't know what you like. Maybe it would be good to have this on the front and the other one on the back. But now, actually, a few years after, the label is only like this. So I'm a bit disappointed because it's neither the bikini or the CO2 label. Maybe the beer is still the same. And this is a fashion I saw. This is a climate fashion. It's getting warmer, so you don't need a lot of dress. But you can use these recycled newspapers, so this is very climate friendly. And also in 2009, before the climate meeting, we had a very important high-level meeting here in Copenhagen, where the Olympic Committee was meeting. I don't know if you remember that event. It was the US, Japan, and Brazil fighting about where the next Olympic Games should be. And from the US, President Obama and the wife came, and Oprah Winfrey came. And then she was inviting Princess Mary and the Crown Prince and some others to get into the Oprah show to tell why Danish people is the most happy in the world. But I was glad that the royal family was smart enough to say we don't participate in Oprah Winfrey's show. But then she went out to a very fashionable, modern, new apartment in Denmark. I saw that, and that was part of the show, and it was so wonderful, and oh, it's fantastic and lovely and all that. Until she got a very big shock when she saw the refrigerator, which was so small compared with the American standard, and she said, oh, I don't understand how you can be so happy. So this was a shock to her, but it also shows that there's a big potential for energy savings also in the US. So I think it was a good conclusion on that. So that will bring me to the conclusions that the extreme weather events, as I showed, they happen very frequently. Every day you can find it in the news. And I think this is a strong sign on how serious climate change is. And the poorest countries of the world is hit worst and most. The equity dimensions are important, and they are masked in all these studies because they're hidden in different assumptions. You don't really see how these things are built into the calculations. We are juggling around with the world, like dancing with the world, and I think it's time to introduce a strong management of economic growth. And then we are told we should always be very balanced, so that's why I brought this picture, because this shows how good climate change is. Look at the happy dog and the happy boy, this is really fun. So we should always remember all the good sides of the story. Thank you.